Next, let us discuss about function generators. A function generator will look like a function, but we can pause and resume while executing its code. To help us pause and resume execution of code, we can use the new yield keyword and the next method. The next method moves the execution forward until the next yield is reached. Let us look at an example of a function generator. Function star is a new keyword, and then the rest of the definition looks like a normal traditional function definition. We can pass in parameters over here, and then the body is within curly braces. As you can see, this example is using the yield keyword 3 times. When code within a function generator is being executed, and if yield keyword is encountered, then the execution is paused at that point. So we have 3 yield statements here, and so we can say that in this function generator, when the code executes, it will be paused 3 times. Let us quickly compare how code executes within a function with how code executes within a function generator. Here on the right, we have a function f, and it has 2 lines of code. To execute the code within f, we require 1 line of code, and that is f followed by brackets. Just this 1 line of code is sufficient to execute the entire function body of f. If we want to execute the body of a function generator, we have to do at least a couple of steps. The first step is that we need to call the function generator using its name and the brackets. What this will do is it will return a controller or an iterator. And then we need an extra step to call the next method on the controller. What the next method will do is it will execute code within the function generator until a yield expression is encountered. So the next method and the yield keyword work together. So executing code of a function generator is not the same as executing that of a function. We need to execute the code in several steps. The first step would be to get hold of a controller and then invoke the next method on the controller. Since calling the next method executes the code until a yield expression is encountered, and since we have multiple yield statements here, so we need multiple next method calls here as well. So we need at least 2 steps. The first step is calling the function generator with brackets, and that gives us a controller or an iterator. And then on the controller, we need to call the next method. The number of times we need to call the next method will depend on the number of yield statements that are there in the function generator body. Let us trace how the execution proceeds in the controller code here and in the function generator code here. On the left, we have the controller code, and on the right, we have the function generator code. Let's assume the arrow over here is pointing to the line of code that is being executed in the controller code. So it's pointing to the first line of code right now. When the controller code starts executing, the execution proceeds as follows. It starts over here and it continues until the next method call is encountered. At this point, what happens is the execution within the controller code will pause, and the execution will be transferred to the function generator over here. And as I mentioned before, when we call the next method, the code within the function generator will be executed until a yield expression is encountered. So let's trace the execution now. So when controller.next is executed, what happens is the execution is paused and the code within the function generator starts executing, and it proceeds until the yield statement is encountered. At this point, here on the right hand side of the equals operator, we have the yield keyword and then 1. When yield 1 is processed, what happens is the execution is paused over here and 1 is sent over to the controller code side. So the execution is paused and 1 is sent over as part of a message to the controller code side. As you can see, 1 is part of the message that is sent over to the controller code side. The message includes 2 properties. The first property is done and the value is false, indicating that execution of the function generator body is still not complete. and 1 is the value that appeared beside the yield keyword. At this point, the execution now continues within the controller code and it moves to the next line. And in the next line, we again have a next method call. And this time we are passing a string ABC to the next method. What happens is the execution is paused over here now, and ABC will be transferred to the generator code. So the execution gets paused and ABC is sent over to the generator code side. At this point, the execution resumes within the generator code and it continues until a yield statement is reached again. The execution is paused over here. 2 will be sent over to the controller code side. So the execution is paused and 2 will be passed over as part of a message to the controller code. As you can see, the value is 2 and done is still false, indicating that there are more lines of code in the function generator to be executed still. Now the execution resumes in the controller code and it continues until the next method call again is invoked. And as you can guess, the execution will be paused over here now and PQR will be transferred over to the generator code side. So the execution is paused and PQR will be transferred over to this location. Now the execution resumes within the generator code and proceeds until the next yield statement is encountered, which is this line of code here. As you can guess, the execution will be paused over here and 3 will be transferred over here. So the execution gets paused and 3 will be transferred as part of a message over here. As you can see, the value is 3. Done is still false, indicating that there is still some code to be executed within the function generator body. At this point, execution of the controller code now resumes and it continues until the next method is again invoked. And just like we have been discussing, the execution will now be paused over here and XYZ will be transferred over to the generator side over here. So execution will be paused and XYZ will be transferred over here. At this point, the execution resumes within the function generator and proceeds to the next line of code. And as you can see, we have reached the end of the function generator body, and the last line of code is a return statement and it's returning the value 100. When this line of code gets executed, what happens is we get a message here in the controller with done as true and the value as 100. Done is true, indicating that the function generator body has finished executing. And then the return value of the function generator, which is 100, will be passed as the value within this message. Function generators are a powerful tool to help us with asynchronous programming. We will use function generators with Redux sagas to make API calls. One final point about this example, you might have noticed that we have 4 next method calls here while we have 3 yield statements here. The reason that we need an extra next method call in the controller code is because the first next method call triggers the execution of the function generator code. So this first next method call will trigger the execution of the generator code and it will pause when the yield expression is encountered. And to resume execution from each of the yield statements, we need 1 next method call each.